I was in my second year of grad school at Northwestern University, and I was looking for a house of worship. And I found a really good church that had great worship and fresh, inspiring messages delivered by Dr. Heisel B. Taylor. It was Second Baptist Church in Evanston. And I attended there for about a year. And the second service at Second Baptist started at 10:50. Now, I don't know when the closing prayer was. I never stayed for the entire service, even though I went for a year. Don't be judgy. Don't be judgy. I left at 1:10. That's 2 hours and 20 minutes in each Sunday because the dorm cafeteria I was in closed at 1:30, so I had to leave. It was a great experience. I loved being there. But every time I attended Second Baptist, probably about 40 times in that year, I was asked if I was a visitor and if I would like to sit in the visitor section. Why was I asked? Well, on a typical Sunday, when I look around, I would see so many beautiful faces, but rarely see a white face. The sanctuary would be filled with 400 or so Black folks and about 3 to 5 white folks. It was a wonderful and eye-opening experience for me. For the first time in my life, not only was I not the majority group, but I was an extreme minority representing 1% of the church, of any group. I clearly stuck out. I received many smiles and warm greetings, and only a few frowns and snarls. I had one really special memory experience. I was hurting and stressed and burnt out, and Dr. Heisel B. Taylor was preaching hard, but he preached about how God was the waymaker. He'd find a path. He'd provide a path where there was no path, because I was feeling like there was no path. I felt hopeless and helpless. And I cried and I cried. I didn't care who saw me. It's one of those where you cry so hard, you're kind of, when your shoulders kind of go bounce up and down, up and down. And maybe you've had one. I wept so hard. I'm glad I wasn't a woman, because my mascara would have run like Tammy Faye Baker's. It would have just run and run. I cried that hard, right? And when I finally opened my eyes, I saw a Kleenex being offered to me by my neighbor to the left. I saw this gentle Black hand offering me a tissue, and my heart melted. And that the simple act of compassion and kindness across race touched me deeply. It still does. And always treasure that memory. This morning, I'm delivering this message and talking about the subject with some trepidation. This might come as a surprise, but I am white. I wanted to get that out there, okay? That I'm speaking from a limited perspective, as I've never been, to my knowledge, actively and systemically discriminated against in my life. Being white has not provided or caused any difficulties or additional barriers to my success, so I can't really talk personally to the heaviness and the oppression of racial discrimination that's played a role in so many people's lives. However, race, discrimination, inequality, and poverty, the oppression of poverty, are too vital to not talk about or take action on. So this morning, I'd like us to do just two things. I'd like us to put on our learning caps, as we did when we were in school, right? You're in elementary school, he said, put on your learning caps. We'll hopefully learn about these topics, and there'll be some aha moments, like, I didn't know that. Or that makes sense now, I get it. Or, and I'd like us to put on God's glasses to see the world, see these topics from God's perspective, get his insight. And then next week, we'll lace up our gym shoes, we'll put on our warm-up suits, because next week is about us taking action to help alleviate poverty in this country, help to alleviate discrimination and inequality. Race has been an issue in the US and in the church for several centuries. and it's become front and center again with the killing of George Floyd and the country's reaction of protests to it. What these events have kind of revealed to me is that there's a lot of pain and frustration and hurt and bitterness, and particularly among our Black brothers and sisters. With the opportunistic looting aside, it's clear that this hurt and this pain and this frustration was just under the surface. It took one event for that to become front and center, and it festered and it galvanized into this amazing kind of unbelievable set of protests. And I think this is what happens when generation after generation experience intentional and now mostly unintentional discrimination, significant inequality, and the humiliation and indignity of poverty. This message will include education, so we can be more knowledgeable, so we'll be able to allow us to engage and interact with others in a more informed and confident manner. I received my PhD in sociology from Northwestern, and a significant part of my studies were on race, class, and poverty. And I believe, and this is part of the reason for the education, I believe that many people from all perspectives on this matter use terms and concepts interchangeably when they shouldn't, and it confuses and it causes misunderstanding. For instance, think about the term systemic racism. Systemic racism. It's very complex, often misused concept, and it means so many different things to so many different people, right? And there's a lot of big issues, but let's do this, and I'll share my screen. Let's do this. Let's talk about racism as the first thing that we do here. Racism is the belief that race is the main determinant of human qualities, characteristics, and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race or races. And we kind of have read about this in the history books, right? About Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and their belief that the Aryan race was superior to all other races, but particularly to Jews and Blacks and Gypsies and handicapped folks and so on and so forth. We essentially see racism in most, if not all, countries where there are multiple ethnicities, races, and religions. It's a human condition. It's a sin in the human condition. But it's been harsh in the US, wouldn't you admit? It's been harsh. It's born out of the institution of poverty, of slavery that's existed for over 200 years, and then the aftermath of that. The belief that my race or group is superior over others creates a level of division, deep division, pain. It's damaging. However, and here's a good distinction, it does not have real teeth until it's translated into discrimination. So discrimination is defined as actions, not beliefs, actions that treat the supposed inferior race, ethnicity, or religion really harshly, adversely, or unequally. Right? So racism often leads to the majority, racism by the majority group often leads to discrimination. However, in the long term, listen to what I'm saying, in the long term, discrimination needs negative stereotypes and prejudice to survive and thrive, right? Because they justify discrimination, unequal conditions, and so forth. A stereotype is an oversimplified image of an idea of a person based on their group identity: Irish, Italian, Chinese, Jewish, white, Black, and so forth. Prejudice is a close cousin. It's preconceived idea about a group, race, ethnicity, religion that's applied to everyone in the group. So that means you are doing what? You're judging someone by their exterior, not by their quality, the quality of their character. That's the opposite of what Martin Luther King said in I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream that my 4 children one day will live in a nation where they will be judged, not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Isn't that what we all hope for? Right? But prejudice doesn't allow that. Prejudice and stereotypes don't allow that. Let me say this too. We all have prejudice, prejudicial thoughts. We all have misconceptions. We have stereotypes. Every one of us, all races have them. And if we say we don't, we're fooling ourselves. What are your impressions? What are your prejudice? What are your stereotypes? What are mine? What are they? They're there. They might be under the surface, but they're there. Do you have one set of notions or impressions about Blacks depending on, and then the second set of notions for Blacks based on class? Said a different way, do we think differently about middle-class professional minorities in the suburbs, like doctors, lawyers, businessmen, attorneys, nurses, and so forth, than we do folks who live in the inner city? I think oftentimes we do. To help illustrate how discrimination works in the US, I'd like us to talk a little bit about the drastic, often extreme differences between majority, mostly white, and the minority, mostly Black, experienced in America. The inequalities are stark and gut-wrenching in every aspect of life, but I'll only focus on a couple. These differences and inequalities, we in this church would not tolerate for a second. If we were in the inner city and had these conditions, we would never, for a moment, ever tolerate them. It would be unacceptable, right? Unacceptable. Education would be the first one. It's an education from kindergarten through high school that we see life-altering inequalities begin. The vast differences in per-student spending are reflected in beat-up, crumbling facilities in the inner city, conditions that we would find horrifying and unacceptable. I've been to a number of these schools a while back, and they were broken down and outdated, and it broke my heart. We've heard news stories about the digital divide, right? Where the suburban schools are technology rich with wired smart classrooms, Chromebooks, students who have laptops and smartphones. On the other hand, children go to inner city classrooms that are often overcrowded with 30 to 40 children. They're broken, frequently low technology environments. Sometimes students talk about not having textbooks or not having paper and pen and paper and supplies. And they often have to battle hunger and violence to focus on school. So what's the main difference then between sort of an inner city child in the inner city, and one in the nice suburb? It can be in the matter of where you're born, right? Perhaps being born a few miles apart. Think about a child who'd be born, let's say, in the Austin neighborhood of Chicago, in the inner city, and another one who's born just 2 miles away in a middle-class family in Oak Park. Just 2 miles. So how are these inequalities perpetuated? Great question. A huge driver, again, of the inequality is the difference in funding per student. A vast majority of the funding for K through 12, I think you might know this because you pay property taxes in the US, is local funding, right? Wheaton Warrenville School District 200, where my wife Kathy works as a physical therapist, receives 85% of funding from local sources. which is essentially property taxes. 11% from state, 4% from federal. I know this to be true because my property taxes every year, the line item that says District 200 is $7,200 per year, right? And because property values are different in the inner city than they are in the suburbs, the ability to raise funding for schools is vastly different, which leads to incredible inequities, inequalities in funding. In fact, Naperville, District 203, $16,000 spent per student, right? All this to say that the conditions are incredibly different. And if your child were attending an inner city school and we knew about the way the schools in Naperville and in Wheaton, in Glen Ellen, Oak Park, in Oak Brook, right? The first thing we would do is try to move somewhere else, right? Move to the better suburbs with the better funded schools. But if we were unable to do that, with knowing what we know now, with our current perspective, right, and our current circumstances, we would rebel and fight ferociously, day in and day out, for better schools and better funding. Do you doubt that? Knowing what we know now, we would fight endlessly, because 13 years of substantial economic or educational disparity produces a clear and negative causal chain, right? This negative causal chain has severe and negative impact on life outcomes. So here's the chain. Lower college entrance test scores mean a reduced ability to be admitted to a good or great, high quality academic institution. And minority populations, particularly from the inner city, score much more poorly on college entrance tests. The SAT, for instance, significantly lower, but substantially lower on the SAT. And this, again, disproportionately impacts minorities. If you wanted to think about an example, the University of Illinois is not trying to discriminate or be racist about the composition of their student body, right? But the ACT does play a huge role in the admissions process. The average ACT score at University of Illinois is 26 to 32 out of 36, right? And many good and top quality recruiters come to University of Illinois to recruit, particularly accounting firms. The accounting department is great. But if a minority student who wants to be an accountant gets an ACT score of 18, their chances of getting into the University of Illinois are very, very limited. Or a great number of, maybe a few that are admitted, but not a great number are admitted with an 18. So they're shut out of the University of Illinois, shut out of the accounting department, and they're shut down from interacting with these good recruiters from good companies. This is called institutional discrimination. Institutional discrimination. And what it means is that even though it's not intentional, because University of Illinois wants quality students and a quality reputation, and they only accept certain quality students, that shuts out folks with lower scores, right? So let's go back to college again. With lower overall quality education from K to 12, could also create struggles when you are in college. So the differences in analytical thinking, in conceptual thinking, in critical thinking, highly emphasized and focused on and developed in suburban schools, can make the difference between success and failure in college, right? So college graduation rates are much lower amongst minorities for several reasons. Some are economic, but this is one of them. The differences in the quality of education impacts their ability to do the coursework. And I think we understand why this is a monumental disadvantage, right? And only have a few more minutes on this and we'll be back. The best way to reproduce, you know it, the best way to reproduce social and economic class of ours for our children to ensure their continued middle classhood, right, is for them to get a degree from a quality educational institution, right? We know it leads to better and more occupational choices and the development of a social network of friends who help them with jobs through their lives. Again, if our children were in the inner city, knowing what the schools look like, maybe our brother or sister or cousin or friend lives in Naperville or Oak Brook or Wheaton, and we can see the difference of the shiny, sparkling schools in those districts versus the beat up, sometimes rodent infested, broken down facilities my kids are in, where the violence is all around. You would not stand for it for a moment. We wouldn't stop until the inequality was addressed. Healthcare. How about healthcare? It's really about the quality. It's about quality and the timeliness of access to healthcare. Many minorities in the inner city have very few options from a medical care perspective. You kind of get what you get, right? Your kids go to the clinic and they get the doctor who's there. No appointments. You just go and you first come, first serve. When we had Claire, we took her in for baby wellness. That was a big deal for us, right? And we had dozens and dozens of pediatricians we could have chosen, right? We had a lot of choice. Conversely, my wife, Kathy, worked at Cook County for, I think, 4 years as a physical therapist. She watched day in and day out as mothers with premature children came in, and they stayed in that waiting room because it was first come, first serve, no appointments. In a beat up, beat down, old tile floor, beat up furniture, no air conditioning, and they had to wait sometimes hours and hours. Figure on burning an entire day, getting there, being there, and then getting home. An entire day. That's a little bit different than my experience where I go to my doctor, carpeting, nice couches, comfy chairs, air conditioning, and so forth. And when I go to a doctor, if from the time I get there to the time I see a doctor, if it's more than 30 minutes, I start to get agitated and ask, what's going on, what's going on? So I've learned actually to calm down a little bit. I bring my work because I know sometimes I have to wait an hour, but I'm waiting an hour. I'm not waiting 7 hours, okay? If I talked to church members and friends and family over the years, I've heard this so many times. We were so blessed and fortunate because my wife, my dad, my mom, my children had this disease or condition. And we were able to see the expert for that disease or condition in Chicago, Illinois, the Midwest. And it made all the difference. They recovered because of it. How many of you heard that or said that? You had choice, and choice of experts, right? In fact, when I injured my knee about 1.5 years ago, my left knee, and I went to a physical therapy for 6 months. And I every Saturday I get to Monday, like Tuesday, Thursday, I'd go my regular physical therapist. On Saturday, there would be a rotating physical therapist. So I actually got to see 7 different physical therapists during that time. And it was the 7th one that could see right into my issue. And within a couple weeks, I had relief after 6 months of pain. It was one person who could see with the eyes. And I know you've had that experience where other doctors couldn't see it, but one could. If you're in the inner city, you get one choice, the doctor you get, and you got to wait for him for 5 hours or 7 hours. So that's unacceptable to us, isn't it? And there's so many other areas of inequality and differences between the majority and minority experience. How about choice of housing? where you live, right? It's not, it's bounded by economics, but there are a lot of choices. When you're in the inner city and you're poor, you have very few choices. Neighborhood safety or neighborhood violence. Wow. Can you imagine fearing for your kid's life every time they left the house? You see or hear gunshots, you hear friends around you talk about rapes and deaths and maimings and that sort of thing. How about social networks for jobs? The differences there. Or the justice system. How about sentencing, where the same crime is committed and the minority gets more time than the majority of the white person does because of their ability to afford a great lawyer. However, there's only one more I want to talk about, and that's the police. For me and for us, if we heard of suspicious noise around our house, what would we do? We'd be like, call 911. The first thing we do is try to get police officers over. Or if we saw a police car just happen to come by, we would be so happy because they would be shining the lights and they would be, and scare the criminal away. So much relief, right? The only exception for me, and maybe this is the same is true for you, is when I'm driving and I see in my rearview mirror that a police car is pulled out and their cherries are going, their lights are going, and I think they're pulling me aside. So what's your first thought? Your first thought is, oh my gosh, they're coming after me. Your heart starts racing. Your stomach drops. You start feeling queasy, right? That's the only example where I see a police car and I'm highly nervous. Imagine if every time you saw a police officer, you had a reaction that was even worse than that. You had even more fear. There's little trust between inner city communities and police officers. And, are all police officers bad? No, just a few. A vast majority of them are good. It's the few that are magnified and publicized, right? There are bad doctors that write prescriptions, to get people, they're essentially drug dealers, right? We have bad lawyers. We have bad businessmen, immoral businessmen, right? There's always a chunk of every profession. The same with police. But really, it's really unbelievable for many folk how overwhelming it is. So the discrimination and inequality is in education. It's in the quality and choice and timeliness of healthcare, neighborhood safety or neighborhood violence, our housing quality or choice, our social networks for jobs, criminal sentencing, our relationship with the police, how responsive politicians are, understanding what buttons and power to push. I mean, the inequality is in every single aspect of minority life in the inner city. So let's go back to systemic racism. I believe that when Black folks shout systemic racism, it means they feel discriminated against in all these areas. They have obstacles and challenges to what? Daily survival for themselves and their family. For those in the inner city, they face unequal choices and opportunities and conditions in every area of their life. It's the hopelessness born out of the totality of all these obstacles and the harsh circumstances, and out of the daily struggle and severe indignity of living in poverty. So some among us kind of grew up maybe in poverty, but most of us had what? The hope of a better life. Many in this church have chosen to make that massive trek across the ocean to come to this country because of a dream of a better future. And most of us have realized those dreams, right? And they've been fulfilled how? By working long hours, education, perseverance, overcoming obstacles, never giving up, and through God's grace and mercy and blessing. It was a recipe for success. We worked super hard, blood, sweat, and tears. It was difficult at times, really difficult. but we made it through, often with the help of family, friends, and a network. Many ethnicities have put up with the inglorious insults of stereotypes and prejudice. Irish were drunks. Chinese were laundromats. Remember no tiki no washi? I remember hearing that when I was a kid. Italians were all mobsters. Germans were that. Jews were this, and so on. And most of these stereotypes, often spread by the social class just one notch above to try to keep down these new immigrants, over time they dissipated. Over time they lessened. However, and we're getting pretty much soon, we're going to get to the God's view of race, class, and poverty. However, the Black experience has been vastly different. Africans were kidnapped from their homes. They were stuffed into and chained up and stuffed into ships and brought across the sea in horrid conditions and forced into unpaid labor in the US. They're the only group that came to the US against their will. Legal chattel slavery lasted over 200 years in the US. Slave owners actually thought of their slaves as their property that they could control like cattle. After legal slavery ended and the Civil War ended, a different actor stepped in the form of discrimination, stereotypes, Jim Crow laws, where Blacks would have separate but very unequal facilities they couldn't mix. These all combined to exclude Black folks from proper education, from good jobs. They were excluded from unions. They couldn't move up economically. They weren't allowed to mix socially. The stereotypes against Black folks, it wasn't that they were, as Irish, they were drunk, or Germans, that they're efficient and don't care about people or whatever, because everything's got to be efficient, right? But the stereotypes and prejudice against Black folks have been harsher and deeper than those against other races, impugning their capabilities, work ethic, character, their goodness. Hopefully we've gotten a little taste of what systemic racism, but it's really not systemic racism, it's systemic discrimination or inequality looks like, feels like. Again, it's important to note that most all of us in America are not purposely or intentionally perpetuating discrimination or inequality. Rather, here's the hard part about it, guys. Listen to what I'm saying right now, if you haven't heard what I've said, that this systemic discrimination is built into every one of our systems, into education by how it's funded, into housing, into healthcare, into the justice system, right? It's already built in and going on autopilot, and will continue to perpetuate and reproduce the inequalities until something is done. It won't dissipate on its own. Okay, wow. Let's take a breather. That's a lot, isn't it? Thank you guys for listening. So what does God think about all of this? Is he like, man, I sure hope my people figure this whole discrimination thing out? Or good luck with that? Or oppression, yeah, whatever. There's always been oppression, not a big deal. Or, hey, let the oppressed pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So, what do we think God's image is of discrimination, of inequalities? Is it something that bothers him, or is it something that's really not a big deal? I believe racism and discrimination and oppression and deep poverty wound the heart of God. Why do I say this? Because the scriptures are full of the Father's heart towards the poor. towards the oppressed, towards the fatherless, towards the widow. God created each one of us in his image. We are his workmanship. Psalm 139 says this, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb." Every single one of us, every single human has been knit together in the mother's womb by God. Wow. So what does God call us to do? What is God's view towards this? I'm glad that you asked. Here we go. Are you ready? Here's God's view. God calls us to care for the poor. He says in Psalm 82, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. James 1:27, we went through this recently. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Isaiah 1:17 says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the cause of the widow. So we could have gone slide after slide after slide, but it's clear that God cares about the oppressed, right? And wants us to do something about it. It's not, so isn't it interesting? We go to bookstores, we go online, we look for books, and a lot of them are on how to pray better, how to fast, how to get more out of the Bible, about personal piety. But God also calls us to uphold justice. In Psalm it says, what is the foundation of his throne? Righteousness, justice and righteousness are the foundation of his throne. It's who God is, right? He's right and he's just. And he wants us to enact justice. And justice is not the poor being oppressed and pushed down generation after generation. But caring for the poor and oppressed is also a sign of being a believer. Did you know that? Proverbs 29:7 says, the righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no concern. And listen about the mocking tone of people who oppress the poor. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker. Whoever is kind to the needy honors God. And then we have that big story in the famous parable, the sheep and the goat, in Matthew 25. The sheep were the ones that cared for those that were hurting. The goats were the pretenders or the non-believers who didn't show concern, right? And we know what happened with the goats, right? They didn't make it. God wants us to stand up for the poor and the oppressed, to bring about justice for them. This is part of our call as believers. Poverty and oppression are so heavy and tyrannical and hurt God's heart. We need to actively help move the U.S. from the current state of vast inequalities to one of equal opportunity, to create a level playing field. Hear what I'm saying here, folks. I'm not saying that everyone should have equal outcomes, equal rewards, right? Equal results, just equal opportunity. Regardless, we will always have people who are more driven, who are more innovative, more hardworking, more creative, apply themselves more appropriately, and they should get rewarded. So there will be different outcomes. But this is important. The recipe for success should be the same for everybody. Everyone should be able to work hard and persevere and get education and get housing so that they can be successful. Everyone should have the equal chance of being successful. If you're in the inner city, maybe the chances are 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. If we're in the suburbs, maybe the chances are 50 or 60 or 70%. We need not equal results or outcomes, but equal opportunity. That's what God calls us to. So now what? Not only does God call us to care for the poor, and it's a sign of being a believer, it's part of our call as a believer. And I when I realized this from my studies, I was like, being a call to justice is a call for us all Christians. I was like, I am convicted. Oh my gosh, that's just, anyway. All right, but there's a couple more things I want us to talk about here. The next thing I want to talk about is we are united and made one in Christ. You know that Christ united the Jews and the Gentiles into one humanity, right? That is, Christ made peace between two groups had a great hostility and animosity towards each other. Why? The Jews knew that they were God's people and felt superior to the godless heathens. The Gentiles felt the Jews were self-righteous and arrogant and excluded them. This sort of sounds like real racism and real discrimination. Jews excluded them from their houses, from their synagogues, from their social circles, I'm sure from their jobs as well. What does Ephesians 2:14-16 say? Very healing and very beautiful. For he himself is our peace, who made two groups into one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. By setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations, his purpose was to create in himself one humanity out of two, thus making peace. And in one body to reconcile, make peace between both of them to God through the cross, which put to death their hostility. In Christ, whose death on the cross makes us right with God, right? We are made into one body. The two are made one. Note that there were strong walls of hostility, barriers between these two groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, who lived separately from each other. Sound familiar? We have a lot of racial separation. Some of that's based on class, but a lot of it's based on race. We have strong walls between us, but God is bigger, God is better, and he can help us knock them down. And finally, the last thing that God wants us to know is that we will be united and stand as one before him, right? And when I did my installation service, my very short, much shorter sermon than this, I said basically that we would all be standing before God together, right? All of us from all nations. And that's what we want in our church. After this, I looked and behold, a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and language, standing before the throne, before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. Will the lower class folk, will the minorities be in tattered robes with beat up palm branches? No, we'll all be one and together, right? Equally. So here's what I want to say. And we're just about ready to wrap this up. Let's live out this unity here on earth as much as we can. Let's stand together as one. We're already reconciled as one people, one race, according to Ephesians 2. It's time to break down the walls and barriers that separate us, to take action. Next week, we will talk about specific actions that we were called to take. And what I'd like us to do is two things for homework. The first one is examine your own stereotypes, your own notions, your own prejudice. We all have them. And if we just kind of, if during your homework you just say, yeah, I don't have any, that's not what I'm talking about, because I know I have had and have some of them, and I want to bring them to God. But please just be thinking about those. Like, would you live in a neighborhood that was 50% Black? Would you live in a neighborhood that was 33% Hispanic? Would you let your daughter or let your son, or want your son or daughter to marry a Black person or a Hispanic person? Just things like that. And you think differently of middle class Black folk versus inner city Black folks, and so forth. Just what are your preconceived notions? Because we need to know that. We also are, for us as individuals, but I also like us not only just to examine it, but to think about what kind of actions we can take. We'll talk about it next week, but what actions can you take as an individual? What can you do as a family? Of course, we want to talk about race and prejudice and stereotypes with our families, right? That's very important. Educate them as well. What are we going to do as a church, and what are we going to do as citizens of this great nation? So, none of this was to create any shame or guilt, right? It's all about moving forward from here. Discrimination and inequality will never dissipate if the current way of doing things continues, right? If we don't work to create that greater equality. And that's probably going to take a generation or two, but it's not going to ever happen unless we are intentional about dismantling things that create these unconscionable conditions for people. And it's only because they had been unfortunate enough to grow up, to be born in an inner city.
Thank you for watching this video. I'm Wayne Krummeyer, and I'm lead pastor of International Community Church in Lombard, Illinois. And love it if you subscribe to our channel and send this link to your friends. Thank you, and God bless.